The year was 1977. The détente period, intended to thaw the frozen tensions of the Cold War, instead felt like a fragile crust of ice over a deep, frigid ocean. In Northern Virginia, nestled between the established suburbs of McLean and Falls Church, lay a community known as Whispering Pines. It was not listed on most maps, and its entrances were deliberately understated. This was by design. Whispering Pines was a CIA-managed housing complex, a domestic enclave for officers, analysts, and operations personnel assigned to Langley. It was, on the surface, the absolute zenith of American suburban idealism. Split-level homes with manicured lawns, communal swimming pools, and children riding bicycles down quiet cul-de-sacs. But beneath this veneer of tranquility, the atmosphere was thick with an unspoken collective tension. Every resident was cleared. Every spouse knew the rules of discretion. The neighborhood watch was composed of professionals trained in counter-surveillance. The mail was delivered, but residents implicitly understood it was likely screened. The quiet was not peaceful, it was monitored. Living in Unit 14B was Frank Sullivan. Frank was a GS-14, a senior analyst in the Soviet Russia Division, Directorate of Intelligence. He was a quiet man in his late 40s, methodical and precise, having spent 2 decades analyzing intercepts and defector debriefs. He understood the wilderness of mirrors, the term coined by the agency's recently deposed counterintelligence chief, James Jesus Angleton. Frank had survived Angleton's debilitating mole hunts, which had paralyzed the Soviet division for years, by keeping his head down and his analysis strictly empirical. He lived with his wife, Mary, and their 12-year-old son, Timothy. Timothy, or Tim, was a product of this environment, though he didn't fully grasp it. He was quiet like his father, but intensely curious, with a fixation on electronics. His bedroom was a tangle of wires, circuit boards, and Heathkit projects. He operated a shortwave radio, listening to coded numbers stations and the strange static of the world beyond his manicured street. In Unit 14A, the adjoining duplex, lived Arthur Vance and his wife, Helen. They were the perfect neighbors. Arthur worked in the Directorate of Administration, specifically logistics and procurement. He was the man who made sure the overseas stations had their requisite supplies, from specialized photographic paper to generators. He was beige suits, a beige sedan, and a blandly pleasant demeanor. He was often seen tending his roses or offering neighbors assistance with heavy lifting. He was perceived as reliable, unremarkable, and consequently invisible. Frank Sullivan, trained to see patterns, saw only baseline normalcy in Arthur Vance. It was a comforting, if dull, data point in a life defined by suspicion. The initial indicators were subtle, easily dismissed as artifacts of the high-stress environment. Frank Sullivan's profession trained him to look for deviations, but in Whispering Pines, paranoia itself was the baseline. Frank began noticing trivial inconsistencies. His desk at Langley was organized with obsessive precision. He would return in the morning to find a specific report moved 3 millimeters to the left, or his pen angled slightly differently. This was common harassment from the Office of Security, a method of keeping personnel sharp, testing their observational skills. He logged it as protocol demanded, but dismissed it. At home, the anomalies were different. The telephone, a standard bell rotary, would occasionally emit a faint, high-frequency hum after a call was disconnected. It lasted only a second. Frank assumed it was a technical flaw in the secure line switch. Then there was the mail. Frank, like many analysts, received classified summaries delivered by bonded courier. But his personal mail, bank statements, magazines, sometimes felt wrong. The envelopes seemed slightly too moist, the glue flap imperfectly resealed. He examined them under a magnifying glass, finding nothing definitive. He blamed the humid Virginia summers or the new, inexperienced mail sorter. Tim, meanwhile, complained about his own projects. "Dad, the radio's acting weird again," he'd say at dinner. "There's this pop, like a heartbeat, but only on the AM bands. It's strongest near the wall." "It's interference, Tim," Frank replied, not looking up from his newspaper. "We're saturated with signals here. Langley, the farm, Vint Hill. It's just noise." The most significant early sign, missed entirely by Frank, involved Arthur Vance. Vance's work in logistics required occasional weekend hours, or so he claimed. He was meticulous about his lawn, Yet Frank noted that Vance's yard work often coincided precisely with Frank's own family leaving for church or shopping. Vance, it seemed, preferred to be the only one on that side of the street. Vance also cultivated Tim. He'd find old electronics components, vacuum tubes, capacitors, and offer them to the boy over the fence. "Found these cleaning out a supply closet," Vance would say with his bland smile. "Figured you could use them for your projects." Tim was grateful. Frank saw it as harmless, neighborly engagement. He failed to register that Vance was using these interactions to gauge the boy's intelligence, his hobbies, and the layout of the Sullivan house. Vance learned which room was Tim's, which was the master bedroom, and, crucially, which room Frank used as his home study, where he sometimes reviewed unclassified summaries. The incident occurred on a humid Saturday afternoon in August 1977. Frank was at Langley for a rare weekend briefing and Mary was grocery shopping. Tim was alone in his bedroom, attempting to repair a broken model train engine. His room shared a common wall with the Vance duplex. It was an older building, constructed in the 1950s, with hardwood floors and a crawl space beneath. While working on the engine, Tim dropped a minuscule screw. He watched in frustration as it rolled across the floor and vanished into a small, dark gap between the floorboard and the wall, near a heating vent. Knowing his father's precision, Tim knew the screw must be retrieved. He went to the garage and returned with a flashlight and a pry bar. The floorboard near the vent was already loose. Perhaps a heating repairman had left it that way. Tim wedged the pry bar into the seam and lifted. The board groaned and came up, revealing the dark, dusty space between the joists. He shone the flashlight into the darkness, searching for the glint of the screw. He found it, resting on a structural beam. But beside it, nestled deep against the shared wall, was something else. It was a dull, metallic box, roughly the size of 2 cigarette packs stacked together. It was painted flat black, designed to absorb light. A thin, insulated wire snaked from the box and was attached via a small clamp to a copper heating pipe. Another, finer wire, almost like filament, ran from the box and disappeared into a minuscule drill hole in the plaster of the shared wall, leading toward his father's study on the other side. Tim, a child of the agency, felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the crawl space. He knew instinctively this was not part of the house. He had seen similar devices, or at least diagrams of them, in the technical manuals his father sometimes brought home. He did not touch it. He slowly, carefully, replaced the floorboard, pushing it back into place. He sat on his bed, his heart hammering. He waited, motionless, for 2 hours until he heard his father's car crunch on the gravel driveway. He met Frank at the door. "Dad," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "you need to come to my room, and you need to be quiet." Frank saw the look on his son's face. It was not the look of a child who had broken a window. It was the look of an adult who had seen a ghost. He followed Tim upstairs. Tim pointed to the floorboard. Frank retrieved the pry bar and, with practiced care, lifted the board. Frank Sullivan stared at the device. He recognized the design principles. It was a Struna 2 acoustic resonance transmitter, a high-grade KGB listening device. It used the heating pipe as a power source, a parasitic draw on the house's electrical ground, and as a broadcast antenna. The filament wire leading into the wall was a microphone. It was not listening to Tim's room. It was aimed through the wall, at Frank's study. It was listening to him, and it had been planted from inside his own house. Frank Sullivan's mind did not panic. It compartmentalized. His first instinct, drilled into him by years of counterintelligence briefings, was that this was a test, a dangle, a provocation by his own security office to gauge his loyalty or reaction. Angleton may have been gone, but his paranoid methodology remained embedded in the agency's DNA. If he reported this to the Office of Security, OS, and it was their device, he would be acknowledging he found it, failing the test. If he reported it, and it wasn't theirs, he would tip off the internal mole who did know about it. He placed the floorboard back. He took Tim downstairs. "You did exactly the right thing," Frank said, his voice flat. "You will not go in your room until I say so. You will not talk about this. Not to your mother, not to anyone. This is above top secret. This is compartmented. You understand?" Tim nodded, pale. Frank spent the night in his study, sitting in the dark, the unseen transmitter just feet away. He was the target. The device was planted from inside, meaning someone had access. A repairman, a cleaner, or the neighbor. Arthur Vance, the man who worked in logistics, the man with the beige sedan, the man who knew Frank's schedule, the man who had access to agency supply chains, who could obscure the acquisition of a Soviet-made device, the man who lived on the other side of the wall. Frank knew he could not confront Vance. He could not alert security. He had to operate outside the system. The next morning, a Sunday, he drove to a payphone in downtown Washington, D.C. He dialed a number from memory. Miles, he said, when the line clicked. Miles Redding was his former mentor, a man forced into early retirement by Angleton's purges. Miles had been CI, and he still had loyalists. Frank explained the situation using oblique, coded language. I have a pest problem in the attic. A European import. Looks like one of theirs, not ours. And it's nested close to the neighbor's property. Miles was silent for a long moment. This isn't a test, Frank. The OS doesn't use imported pests. They're too proud of their own. Miles understood immediately. You have a technical penetration, and you suspect the vector is adjacent. What's the procedure? Frank asked. There is no procedure, Miles said, his voice gravelly. You are compromised. Your house is compromised. Assume everything is. The system is blind to itself. You must provide it with eyes. Through Miles, Frank was put in touch with two consultants, retired CI technicians who specialized in black bag sweeps. They were loyal to Miles, not the current OS directorate. The operation was set for a Tuesday. Frank arranged for Mary and Tim to be out of the house, a doctor's appointment for Tim. Arthur Vance left for work at 8:04 a.m. as he always did. At 8:30 a.m., an unmarked van, a plumber's van, pulled into Frank's driveway. The two technicians, both men in their 60s, worked with silent, efficient speed. They swept the entire house. They found the Struna 2, confirming Frank's assessment. They also found a secondary device, a clicker bug, inside his telephone handset. But the main device, the one under Tim's floor, was the prize. It's a proximity device, one tech whispered, examining it with a borescope. It's not broadcasting far, maybe just to the next unit. It's recording or retransmitting from there. They confirmed the device was active. It had been planted from the crawl space, but the access point was not in Frank's unit. The technicians checked the exterior foundation. Behind a thick azalea bush shared by both units, they found a small, neatly drilled hole in the foundation, just large enough for a man to snake an arm and the device through, placing it under Tim's floor near the shared wall. The access point was on Vance's side. He's running a full-time operation from 14A, the tech said. He's not just a listening post, he's the station. Frank now had his proof. The technicians photographed everything, disabled nothing, and left the house exactly as they found it. They were gone in 40 minutes. Frank Sullivan now had to move from defense to offense. He began his own surveillance of Arthur Vance. He logged Vance's movements, his mail, his grocery trips. He was running a counterintelligence operation on his own neighbor in the heart of a CIA compound. The confrontation was not a dramatic showdown. It was a cold, procedural escalation. Frank Sullivan, armed with the photographs and the technician's report, bypassed the standard security hierarchy. He requested a no-notice meeting with Deputy Director Carl Kittredge, the new head of counterintelligence, a man brought in to clean house after the Angleton chaos. Kittredge was a pragmatist. He listened to Frank's report in a secure bubble room at Langley, his face impassive. He examined the photographs of the Struna 2. You ran your own sweep, Kittredge stated. It wasn't a question. You bypassed protocol. The protocol is compromised, Frank countered. The device is in my house. The vector is Arthur Vance. He's in logistics. He lives next door to a Soviet division analyst. This isn't coincidence. This is a dedicated operation. Kittredge stared at the photos. The clarity of the breach inside Whispering Pines was staggering. This wasn't a wilderness of mirrors. This was a fox inside the central vault. Your technicians, Kittredge said. Are they reliable? They are Miles Redding's men. That was enough. Kittredge nodded. "Mr. Sullivan, your involvement in this is over. You and your family will act as if nothing has happened. You will go to work. You will buy groceries. You will not speak of this again. Your son, he must remain silent." "He understands the stakes," Frank said. "We will take it from here." The operation shifted. A Special Collection Service, SCS team, a joint CIA-NSA unit, took over. Whispering Pines was suddenly home to a host of new repairmen. Telephone company vans monitored the lines. Electrical workers checked the transformers. The community, accustomed to the presence of security, barely registered the increase. But this was different. Frank's house, 14B, became the listening post. The SCS technicians, entering under the guise of asbestos abatement, installed their own equipment. They now had a direct feed from the Struna 2. They were listening to Vance, listening to Frank. The tension in the Sullivan house became unbearable. Frank and Mary had to stage arguments, discuss mundane finances, and plan vacations, all for the benefit of the man on the other side of the wall. Tim was sent to stay with his aunt in Ohio, under the pretext of a family illness. The house was now a stage, and Frank was the lead actor. The CI team monitored Vance's duplex, 14A, with thermal imagers and laser microphones. They observed him in his study at night, not reading, but operating a high-frequency transmitter. He was communicating, sending Frank's intelligence, now carefully curated disinformation fed to Frank by Kittredge, directly to a Soviet satellite or a nearby diplomatic receiver. Arthur Vance, the beige man from logistics, was a high-level illegal. A deep-cover KGB officer who had somehow burrowed his way into the very heart of the agency's residential infrastructure. The operation ran for 3 weeks. The agency fed Vance a steady diet of chicken feed, low-level, slightly inaccurate intelligence about Soviet missile throw weights and descent in the Eastern Bloc. Vance diligently transmitted it. But Vance, whose real name they would learn was Pyotr Ivanovich Volkov, was no fool. He was a product of the KGB's most rigorous training. He felt the change in the atmosphere. The plumbing vans stayed too long. The new neighbor who moved in across the street had the distinct, flat-footed posture of an OS security man. The noise on his own receivers was different. He sensed the counter-surveillance. On a Thursday morning, Volkov deviated from his pattern. He called in sick to Langley, citing food poisoning. This was the signal the SCS team was waiting for. Volkov left his house at 10:17 a.m. He was not dressed in his usual beige suit. He wore slacks, a baseball cap, and sunglasses. He drove his beige sedan, but he immediately began a complex surveillance detection route, SDR. He drove to Tyson's Corner, entered the mall, and exited through a different department store. He took a bus, then a taxi. The SCS team was flawless. They tracked him using a combination of vehicular and foot surveillance, passing him off from agent to agent. Volkov eventually arrived at Great Falls Park. He carried a newspaper. He walked a specific trail, stopping at an overlook. He sat on a bench, placed his newspaper down, and left. A classic dead drop. The team split. One unit watched Volkov leave. The other monitored the bench. 30 minutes later, a man approached. The assistant cultural attaché from the Soviet embassy, a known officer of the Residentura. He retrieved the paper. The CI team had a choice: intercept the attaché, a diplomatic incident, or let the information go. Kittredge made the call. They let the attaché go. They had what they needed: the undeniable link between Volkov and the Residentura. Volkov returned home, visibly agitated. He knew his SDR had been clean, but he felt the pressure. He spent the night in his study. The thermal imaging showed he was busy. He was cleaning house. Kittredge decided they could not wait for him to bolt. He had to be rolled up now before he could destroy his equipment or enact an escape plan. At 3:15 a.m., the operation went live. There were no sirens, no flashing lights. 2 black sedans parked at the curb. 4 men from the Office of Security, led by Kittredge himself, approached 14A. They did not knock. They used a key, the master key to all units, held by the complex manager. They entered the house silently. Volkov was asleep, his wife beside him. They were awakened by the click of a bedside lamp. Volkov saw Kittredge and the 3 other men standing at the foot of his bed. Volkov spoke first in flawless, unaccented English. "The roses," he said calmly. "I assume you will water them." "Arthur Vance," Kittredge said, "is no longer required here. You, however, are." They took him out of the house in handcuffs, covered by a coat. Helen, his wife, another KGB operative, was taken separately. By 5:00 a.m., the house was empty. A new team was already inside, cataloging the contents of 14A. When Frank Sullivan woke up at 6:00 a.m., he looked out his window. The beige sedan was gone. The house next door was dark. The operation was over. Pyotr Volkov was not taken to Langley or an FBI facility. He was transported to a safe house, a nondescript property in the rural foothills of the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was a debriefing center, designed for isolation and psychological leverage. There was no trial. Volkov was an illegal combatant in an undeclared war. His interrogation was relentless, but adhered to protocol. It was not physical. It was a systemic dismantling of his identity. He was kept in a room with constant, low-level light. There were no clocks. He was subjected to alternating teams of interrogators, one hard, one sympathetic. They already had the Struna too. They had the transmitter from his attic. They had the photographs of his dead drop. For 3 days, he maintained his cover. He was Arthur Vance, a logistics officer, confused and terrified. On the 4th day, Kittredge entered the room. He placed a file on the table. He opened it, revealing an old black and white photograph of a young man in a Soviet military uniform. Pyotr Ivanovich Volkov, born 1931, Minsk, Kittredge said. Recruited by Directorate S in 1952. Trained at Balashikha. Inserted into the U.S. via Canada in 1958. You spent 6 years building your legend as Arthur Vance before applying for a low-level clerk position at the State Department. You transferred to CIA Logistics in 1968. You have been active for 19 years. Volkov stared at the photograph. The mask of Arthur Vance dissolved. His posture straightened. The blandness was replaced by an iron-hard gaze. You missed the transmitter in the attic for 9 years, Volkov said, his English now tinged with a slight Slavic accent. It took a child to find the Struna. The institutional response within the CIA was seismic. Volkov's breach was not just a failure of security, it was a failure of imagination. He had exploited the agency's greatest weakness, its bureaucratic classism. The CI division had been obsessed with high-level analytical moles, the princes of the agency. They had ignored the janitors and clerks. Volkov, from his position in logistics, had been a master of soft intelligence. He didn't steal major plans. He reported on procurement. He noted when the agency ordered specialized radio batteries for Central America, indicating a new operation. He tracked the increased ordering of cold weather gear for the Afghan desk, years before the Soviet invasion. His primary target, however, was Frank Sullivan. By listening to Frank's private conversations, his frustrations, and his analytical theories, Volkov was providing Moscow with a direct window into the mind of the Soviet Russia division. He was reporting on what the CIA thought the Soviets were thinking, the most valuable intelligence of all. The mole hunt that followed the Vance breach was swift and brutal. Vetting for all support staff was radically intensified. Polygraphs became a biannual ritual. The culture of assumed trust in cleared communities like Whispering Pines was shattered overnight. The consequences of the Vance breach spread slowly, like a chemical contaminant. For Whispering Pines, it was the end. The discovery that a KGB illegal had lived, socialized, and tended his roses alongside them for nearly a decade destroyed the community's purpose. The secure enclave had been a mockery. Trust evaporated. Neighbors eyed each other with renewed suspicion. Was the quiet accountant in 12C also a plant? The complex was quietly decommissioned by the agency within 18 months. The houses were sold on the open market, and the CIA's experiment in managed living was over. For Pyotr Volkov and his wife, their fate was procedural. They were too valuable to keep and too dangerous to prosecute publicly. A public trial would expose the CIA's vulnerabilities. 6 months after his capture, Volkov was part of a quiet exchange. On the Glienicke Bridge in Berlin, the Bridge of Spies, Volkov was traded for 2 low-level agency assets captured in Prague and a prominent Soviet dissident. He disappeared back into the USSR, presumably to a hero's welcome. The most profound and most tragic consequences were reserved for the Sullivans. Frank Sullivan was technically a hero. He had identified the threat. Yet, in the paranoid calculus of counterintelligence, he was now contaminated. He had been the target of a hostile operation for an unknown number of years. His analysis, his thoughts, his entire professional output was now considered compromised. He was quietly transferred from the Soviet Russia division. His expertise was no longer trusted. Kittredge assigned him to a lateral post in the Directorate of Operations, analyzing South American shipping manifests. It was a bureaucratic dead end. Frank, the expert on Soviet strategy, would spend the rest of his career tracking banana boats. He accepted the transfer without protest. He understood the rules. Tim Sullivan returned from Ohio to a different home. The house at 14A was empty, the yard overgrown. His own home was silent. His father, once engaged and analytical, was now distant and preoccupied. The adventure of finding the transmitter had been replaced by the heavy, oppressive weight of its implications. Tim was debriefed twice by an agency psychologist, a kind man who asked probing questions about what Tim had seen, what he heard, and who he had told. Tim understood this was not about his welfare. It was about damage control. The experience fundamentally altered him. The curiosity that had driven him to explore electronics was replaced by a deep-seated suspicion of them. He no longer trusted the noise in the static. He now listened for the signal. Years dissolved into decades. The Cold War, the central organizing principle of Frank Sullivan's life, shuddered, cracked, and collapsed. Frank retired from the agency in 1988. He and Mary moved to the dry heat of Arizona, as far from the humidity and secrets of Virginia as possible. He lived quietly, playing golf and refusing to read the news. When the Berlin Wall fell, he felt nothing. When the headlines later screamed about Aldrich Ames and Robert Hansen, the great moles who had betrayed the agency from within, Frank read the accounts with a detached clinical interest. They were celebrated as spectacular failures. His own story, the Vance breach, was never made public. It remained a classified footnote, a case study on proximity penetration taught only at the farm. Tim Sullivan did not follow his father into the agency, but he could not escape its shadow. His childhood encounter with the Struna II defined his career path. He studied electrical engineering and computer science, graduating just as the world was beginning to connect itself through digital networks. Tim became an expert in cybersecurity. He was one of the first to see that the crawl spaces of the future would not be physical, but digital. He saw transmitters in lines of code and dead drops in encrypted servers. He specialized in finding the hidden listeners, the Volkovs of the new digital age. He was driven by the memory of that dull black box and the realization that security was an illusion and that proximity, even virtual proximity, was the ultimate vulnerability. The legacy of Pyotr Volkov was felt in the agency's revised vetting procedures. The Vance Protocol became shorthand for the mandatory, exhaustive background checks required for all personnel, regardless of rank or perceived access. The agency learned at great cost that the man who stocks the paper is just as critical to secure as the man who writes on it. The Vance breach serves as a stark case study in the true nature of Cold War espionage. It was not a game of high-stakes action, but a slow, methodical, and patient war of position. Pyotr Volkov's greatest weapon was not a weapon at all. It was his utter, profound mundanity. He weaponized the American assumption that boredom equated to safety. The incident at Whispering Pines highlighted the central paradox of a secure society. By creating an enclave of vetted, cleared professionals, the CIA did not build a fortress. They built a high-density target. They concentrated their most valuable assets in one place, believing a perimeter fence and a guard booth would suffice. Volkov demonstrated that the true perimeter is always human trust, and that is always permeable. There was no moral victory. Frank Sullivan, the dutiful analyst, was professionally sidelined for being the victim of the crime he uncovered. The system, designed to protect national security, ultimately prioritized its own reputation, contaminating the witness to preserve the illusion of its own infallibility. The discovery of the transmitter by Tim Sullivan was the ultimate irony. The multi-billion-dollar counterintelligence apparatus, with all its technicians, polygraphs, and surveillance vans, was defeated by its own bureaucracy and paranoia. It took the non-vetted, non-cleared, apolitical curiosity of a 12-year-old boy dropping a screw through a floorboard to expose the rot at the core. The story of 14A and 14B Whispering Pines is not one of spies and gadgets. It is a quiet, analytical tragedy about the human cost of systemic suspicion, the ambiguity of loyalty, and the realization that in the Cold War, the neighbor complaining about crabgrass might have been listening to far more than the lawnmower.